Good morning, everybody. I am putting a link in the chat to the slides. If you were with us yesterday, it's the same link. And if you are joining us for the first time today, no problem. The slide deck has everything that we talked about yesterday. We're going to do a quick little recap, and then we're going to move on to sharing some new thoughts and tools and resources. So we'll introduce ourselves again, since we do have some new friends with us. I'm Annie Evans. I'm the Director of Education Outreach for New American History based at the University of Richmond here in Virginia. And I am here with my friend and colleague, Ed Ayers, and I'm going to let Ed introduce himself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm still the same person I was yesterday, more or less. I'm a former history professor and historian who's decided that to venture into the exciting world of K-12 education. I learn something every day. I look forward to learning from you today. Thanks very much.
So hopefully everybody's been able to grab the slides. I did want to revisit a couple of questions that came up in yesterday's chat for those of you who are with us. A few people said that they still weren't quite sure how to navigate to certain things. So I want to kind of come off the slide deck. And again, if you weren't with us yesterday, the slide deck is really more your goodie bag at the end of the birthday party, so to speak. And I'm not sure why this is not letting me escape, but there we go. So don't worry if you miss things, because you're getting links to everything that we discussed. And I'm also available through Zoom to Zoom in with you and your colleagues at a planning meeting, a department PD meeting, division PD. I can Zoom in with your class in the fall if you and your colleagues want to have me come in and bring one of these maps or Bunk or one of the other tools and resources we shared to life. So we also today are going to dig into the learning resources library, and many of those learning resources have lessons designed to sort of teach you and your students how to navigate through tools like Bunk, or some of the maps that we're going to look at today, the Valley of the Shadow archive that we looked at. So, so you have lots of different ways to get into the tools and learn how to use them, including some hands-on PD that we can deliver for you. So yesterday we started with a few framing questions, and I wanted to kind of revisit a couple that we didn't get to yesterday. We mentioned that Ed had been on a journey. How many places did you visit, Ed, while you were working on American Visions?
60 places in 24 states.
Yeah. And so a couple of images that we didn't have time to share yesterday that I think are just beautiful. These are all included in the travelogue series that's linked both in Bunk and on our Medium page. And Ed, I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit, because I do want to talk a little bit about place-based learning, because we're going to dig into maps today and they're somewhat related. So do you want to say anything about the trip that you took and how that kind of relates to the work we do with museums and historic sites?
No, I'd rather not, Annie. No, okay, I'll go ahead. I'll say a couple of things. Annie mentioned at the beginning yesterday, we kind of connected over geography, ironically, given that I'm a historian. But ever since the 1970s, yes, when I was in graduate school, I've been fascinated by the idea of being able to see things deployed over space. And I'm a social historian, which means everything I've written is grounded in a place. My sort of professional identity is a historian of the American South. That's what I was hired to teach, and did teach for a very long time at the University of Virginia, and directed a lot of graduate students, some of who teach in Texas, I'm proud to say. And but back in the 70s, it was really hard to map things with a computer. And then I did it again for a book that came out in 91, which means that I was doing it in the 80s, and it was also impossible, which involved all kinds of mainframe computers and plotting things on big pieces of paper, then exploiting my children to cut them out with their tiny fingers and tiny scissors, and then glue them all together, and then take a picture of them, and then make that an illustration in the book. And there was a great thing that I don't think exists any longer, called the Great American History Machine, that linked census data to mapping. And it was just striking to me how much of the patterns that we discuss in history as sort of isolated events took on a whole different meaning if you could see them in place, if you could see them arrayed across the continent. So when I left the University of Virginia to the University of Richmond as president, they asked me if I would be interested in for renewing my commitment to digital history. And I said, yeah, very much so. But I don't want to do what we did in the 90s and the early 21st century, which was transcribing a lot of documents by typing them in. I said, we now have mountains of machine readable data that we can visualize. And we have little supercomputers that we carry around that we call phones that can actually do all this. So what you'll be seeing later is going to be sort of an outgrowth of that initiative, which is visualizing complicated patterns over time in the United States. And as you'll see, colleagues far more talented and committed than I am to this have actually built these things that I imagine. But related to that is that if history always takes place, which it does, there's nothing historical that is not somewhere. And it actually sort of, those of you who might have come to Fort Worth to hear my talk about this period of American history, where we talk about things like the communications revolution or the transportation revolution or the Great Awakening and all that, as very abstract processes. In fact, we're very geographically as well as historically specific. And one of my things that I always urge is that we need to triangulate the events and processes of the past in time and in space. And I've tried to do that in the things that I write, but what a considerable part of New American History is about is giving you and your students the tools to do that yourselves. More precise tools, and I compare these to science was advanced by the microscope and telescope. Well, we finally have new tools, digital tools, that allow us to see things in great breadth that was impossible 20 years ago, and in a kind of detail that was impossible 20 years ago. And New American History and Bunk in many ways are devoted to taking advantage of those opportunities in ways that it just seems that we're simply not. We use so much of the web just to ship around PDF files or little videos that are not, don't take advantage of the capacities of the digital. So Annie, I am going to answer your question, but I thought this was kind of framing.
This is great.
Okay,
Perfect framing.
you've not actually even heard of this before. And how it is that if we're going to see broad patterns, we also need to use the microscope to see small patterns. And as I mentioned yesterday, students remember field trips and visits to museums and historic places as really the embodiment of the history that they've seen. The only places they can actually see history is going somewhere to see where it happened. And in fact, there's a certain kind of romanticism that's involved with this. One of my assignments for freshmen at Richmond was to have them go out and look at some of the historic sites around us. And of course, Richmond has very many, especially about the American Civil War. And they would come back and say, wow, you know, it was nothing like reading a book. Going to a place and really seeing it. I said, well, how do you know that was actually the place? They said, well, there was a sign there, right? And so, you know, what's real and what's manufactured about the past in a place is often unclear. And I do believe that people believe that just visiting a place somehow conveys a reality that they can't get through other things. So I don't disagree with that, but I also think that what that means is that a place is interpreted over and over and over again in many different ways. In the early 90s, there was a book that many people read, including K-12, called Lies Across America. Also, the same author wrote a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, which I don't like, but the whole idea was that a lot of these historic markers and places of interpretation really distort American past. And, you know, so as Liz mentioned yesterday, I've been on the boards of quite a few museums, and for 13 years was the founding board chair of the New American Civil War Museum in Richmond, which is remarkable. And so I had a chance to see behind the scenes a lot at Colonial Williamsburg or many other sites. And I could see all the great goodwill and skill and expertise that people were bringing to bear on the places that I know, like Monticello, for example, which I've watched evolve now for over 40 years and get ever and ever closer to the truth. And so when American Visions was coming out, I persuaded my wife to fulfill a lifelong fantasies that she'd heard me say every time we passed an Airstream trailer on the interstate. God, wouldn't it be great to live in one of those things and travel around? And so in COVID crisis, we got an RV and set out for all these without having any idea at all what we were doing. And the idea was, let's visit the places where all the history I've written about in the book, the places I've imagined from written documents and pictures and videos, what's happening there now? I think the phrase I used was to see where history happened and see what's happened to that history since. And so everywhere we went, I didn't advertise myself as a historian. I just sort of blended in whatever group happened to be there, stood on the edges, tried not to ask too many incriminating questions. And over again, I was so impressed with the ways that these people, interpreters and museum professionals, made the past compelling to audiences that often had something from a 6-year-old kid to a 90-year-old grandparent, and whose politics were not labeled, and you had no idea of what they might be bringing to the site. And then I wrote blog entries, basically, and pictures that my wife Abby and I took of what these places look like. And the general theme of the talk is public history is doing a lot of the work that we would hope all history could do if it were sort of unfettered. It's telling the truth. It's connecting people of all kinds with all kinds of history. And there's enormous energy and commitment. So another purpose of New American History and Bunk is to tie together all the practitioners of history, from elementary school teachers all the way up to the people who run the Smithsonian and historians, together to show our common purpose. So these blog entries were basically efforts to do that. So we covered quite a bit in Texas and quite a bit in the West. You can see, on the left there on your screen, the New Harriet Tubman Museum is great. In the middle there is the American Banjo Museum in Oklahoma City, which I can't say that I knew about before we went there, but it's very powerful. And then on the right is the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And in all those places, this is imagining a part of American history that's so often been trivialized or neglected, of African American life, but especially enslavement, which we're not exactly sure what to say about in American history. Was it a great anomaly, or was it foundational to what the United States was? And that's the whole controversy over 1619 Project and all those kinds of things that you all know so well. So I was very curious in particular, and especially as a Southern historian who's written a lot of African American history, to see what kind of job the country's doing. And it's really doing remarkable work. I will say, just as a kind of a bridge, Annie, back to you, that when we were in San Antonio and visited the Alamo, and there, as Annie mentioned yesterday, there's an episode of The Future of America's Past that's Texas Before the Alamo, and we'd spoken with the interpreters there for that video. Curious to see, how events of recent past have changed. Saw the new, suddenly blanking on who's the drummer for Genesis?
Phil Collins.
The Phil Collins exhibit, which is enormous collection of projectiles and other objects like that, to see how that had changed the story at the Alamo. And it had not really changed it at all. It still made much focus on the few days of military conflict rather than why anything was there. But we can see the $550 million center that's being constructed in San Antonio. And I saw just an article last week, I think in the Washington Post, about the conflicts over that and how people are going to tell it. So in many ways, you're at the center of the story that American Visions tells, which is, how do we account for the parallel and intertwined stories of native dispossession and massive enslavement with the expansion of freedom and democracy at the same time for other Americans. So and not to mention now, of course, the intersection of our history with that of Mexico. How do we tell these stories? And I saw good signs at San Jacinto. I contrasted what had been put up in the 1930s and 40s with what had been put up recently, and saw great progress there. my good friend Andrew Torgett at University of North Texas is working with San Jacinto now to tell a fuller story there. So I know that there's going to be a lot of progress. So Annie, that was more than you called on me to say, but I thought I'd just go ahead and kind of lay it out there so people would know what the purpose of it is. I would say in general, the travel account makes fun of us, especially of me, and my incompetence of handling a 27-foot long vehicle in all kinds of obscure places and often where we didn't intend to go. But it's also intended to maybe give your students a glimpse of history in their own backyard and how an outsider might see it and what we might make of it. Because really, public history is on the front lines, trying to interpret these hard stories. Everything I saw built on scholarship, something I think people tend to forget. All those places are basically building their interpretations around the hard work of plain old academic historians like yours truly. But it's also the case that the people who have special responsibility for bridging all of that are you, the teachers who accompany their students, people who interpret the things in your backyard, have a special opportunity and responsibility. And I'll end with this comment. I had a chance to speak to the National Governors Association a few years ago, and my major appeal to them was fund field trips. Make it possible for teachers to take kids to places in your own states. You'll help those places by adding to a visitation, but you're going to help those students see things that they wouldn't see otherwise. And I know Annie's been out on the road a lot all across the country working with local history, and teachers say, I've driven by this place for a decade and never thought to stop in. I didn't know the great riches they had. So in many ways, that's the purpose of all this, is to show the riches beneath our feet as we think about American history. So I hope you'll find it interesting, and maybe, as Annie suggested yesterday, a casual model that students could do. It'd be easy for students to do what I did: take some pictures, write about it, explain their own experiences. In some ways, that's another reason I did this, is to lower the threshold about what it means to be a historian. All it means is to pay attention, think about time, think about place. Back to you, Annie Evans.
That was perfect. So we want to know what you folks think about place-based learning or other kinds of experiences. So we have a question today. We'd like you to think for a minute or two and respond in the chat. Our good friend Liz will help us read the responses. How does place-based learning encourage historical thinking and help us teach historical empathy? So given what Ed just so eloquently shared with us and your own experiences, we'd like you to respond to that question for a minute.
Yeah, I'd like to know some of the places that you found especially compelling.
Absolutely.
Liz, if it's okay, I'll just go ahead and comment on a couple of these as I see them emerging.
Oh,
Okay.
sure. I was waiting for a couple, but feel free
I
to jump
understand.
in.
I can see what you're doing, but I can't wait. I got all my momentum built up now.
Wonderful.
So Catherine says that she uses it a lot for Civil War battles, and living in the middle of the place where it's all Civil War battles all the time, I've slowly learned how to do that. I have to admit, until I really worked in the field, they just look like big fields to me. I didn't really know how you would make sense of them. But being able to, I've watched skilled people interpret these, and just to figure out that the difference a slight rise in the ground makes, the difference that it makes in trying to imagine how would you array 10,000 people trying to kill each other on this landscape. I do. So I think that's the way, gone Gettysburg many times and watch military leaders come in and use this as a kind of way. So Civil War battles, I think, are a great place. Now there's a whole bunch more things, Liz. I'll hand it back to you if you'd like to go ahead and comment.
Sure. Liz says that it's easier for students to visualize what happened and to get an idea of space. Meredith comments that the Pearl Harbor Memorial made her think of how her family was involved. Jared comments that it makes students put themselves in the place of the people at the location during historical times. It makes them think and imagine. And comments that it helps us connect real time and space to our experiences. We are all historical actors and we can see ourselves in those places. This creates empathy and understanding. Judith also comments that students are better able to visualize and empathize if they see the actual site. Cindy says that her students are geographically challenged. Many of them have never been to Fort Worth or Dallas, and we only live an hour away. So they enjoy doing virtual field trips and it helps make things real to them. So definitely just that being in that physical space, we see that helps create empathy and understanding. Kay Daniel says that I wish that we were able to do more of this. People's experiences become more real and poignant to students when they are able to see where things happen, where people walked, sat, faced injustice, etc. So definitely some common threads here. There's a lot more responses.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's really just triggered an outpouring, all of which are positive. And being typical academic, I'll focus on the one problem here, which is that Eddie says, due to budgeting limitations, have to use virtual field trips more. It's next best thing. So I guess that's a part of the idea. I don't imagine that students in some places are going to be able to visit a place 1,200 miles away. And so, you know, virtual field trips sponsored by the places are great. And I think that that's all good too. So, and I see Samantha talk about not only American history, but Auschwitz and the sort of virtual tours there. So there's a lot of it. I guess so it's interesting that what I see people, it's interesting, more people are talking about 20th century and the Holocaust than they are about history of the 19th century. And one of the things I mentioned in my comment, you can't actually see the Mexican-American War anywhere. You have to go to Mexico to see it. And so it's kind of like a projection. One reason it was so popular for a little while in the United States before it became unpopular was that it didn't really affect Americans in the places where they live. And so I see so many people are saying that even in just going in someplace in your own town can often be eye-opening to people. We know here in Virginia, a lot of kids have never seen the ocean, even though we're that close. So there's that. Okay, Annie.
Well, these are all great responses, and I look forward to seeing the rest of them. As Liz mentioned, there were several others. I did want to touch on a couple of things. A minor tweak that I've been really strongly emphasizing to teachers in the last few years is, rather than calling them field trips, is if we lean into calling them field experiences. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. When I was a kid, a field trip oftentimes meant, yay, a day out of school. And there was oftentimes no connection to what the field trip content or the location we were going to had to do with what we did the day before or the day after. Sometimes schools will take the same field trip every year over and over again. And when I ask why is this a part of your, annual curriculum, they say, well, we always go to Jamestown or we always go there. And when I first moved to Charlottesville, after I was in the classroom for 20 some years, I moved to Charlottesville from Richmond to be the curriculum coordinator. And I went on my first field trip with a group of third graders to Monticello, which is right in our backyard. And they had done it every year since the beginning of time. And I asked the teachers, well, what are you doing to prepare the students? And they kind of looked at me and they said, well, we go every year. And then I said, well, how will you follow up on this and connect it to their learning? And they kind of looked at me and they said, well, we're not doing Thomas Jefferson right now. We're doing, XYZ. And so I said, okay, let's stop and think about this for a moment. And so it really led to a rich discussion about restructuring where we go. And instead of going to Monticello 4 or 5 times between kindergarten and 12th grade, what if we could open that up a little and go to some of the other historic sites, right? But also align our syllabus to make sure that it's connected to something we're actually teaching and learning. And could we pull science into it, for example, with the garden at Monticello? So the other reason I like the term field experience is we're really trying to have kids imagine themselves using the historical thinking and the geospatial thinking skills that we're teaching them in social studies as careers, right? So having students see historians, museum curators, archivists, archaeologists working out in the field, they're having a field experience. They're collecting data, they're making observations, they're analyzing images, they're analyzing artifacts, and those are skills that we try and teach students to do. So mindset wise, sometimes field trip implies one and done, whereas a field experience is connected to real life work that a student could engage in. And when they see that these are jobs and careers in the real world, maybe that's something they would aspire to. So that's just a minor tweak. The other comment I want to make,
if I'm not mistaken, a subtle correction of me. I believe I might have said that phrase in my description of my talk to the governor. So
perfectly fine.
I shall stand enlightened. Great.
The other thing I did want to lean into a little bit, and I can't remember if it was Russell or Daryl, I can remember the name, apologies, but someone mentioned historical empathy. Catherine Parada at Mercer College in Georgia has done some incredible work creating a framework for teaching historical empathy, and I will attach that in the speaker notes to this slide if I didn't already do it. I can't remember if I did, but if I didn't, it'll certainly be there tonight. And if anyone wants more information on that, I'm happy to connect them to that work as well. All right, we're going to kind of use this as a segue because today we're going to take a look at some of the other digital humanities tools and resources that we've been building with our colleagues. We mentioned yesterday, in addition to looking at American Visions and Bunk, we also talked a little bit about the Valley of the Shadow, which was the first really big digital project that made me aware of Ed and his work very early on in my teaching career. And it still today is seen as a model for digital humanities. I'm leaving right after this session to go to Philadelphia to specifically talk about my experiences using the Valley of the Shadow and other digital projects early on in my teaching career and how that kind of transformed my teaching along with the maps that we're going to look at. So one last question I do want to ask is, in what ways do digital archives help you democratize history? And I want you to think of archives more broadly than just documents. So there's lots of different archives available to us now. Ed mentioned, like in his travels, that there are, you know, virtual field experiences versus being there in person, versus nothing on that physical landscape. But also archives are another way for us to bring this history to life. How does the phrase democratizing history hit you when it comes to digging into digital archives? So take a few minutes in the chat to ponder that one, and then we will move into looking at some maps.
I just want to say you folks are doing great. The chat, we really appreciate that kind of vulnerability to sort of ask people to do it. And we've seen that you rose to the occasion. So thanks. No pressure, but we appreciate what you've done so far.
Well, I feel like we learn as much from the group as anything we could possibly share with them today. So, and they learn from each other, which is the best learning there is.
Two and very interesting ones already.
All right, you want to field a couple?
Jared says it makes students feel a part of history by seeing the archives themselves, right? And one of the things I've said changes history from being a spectator sport to being a participant sport, right? That you're actually making history yourself, but with evidence. You're not just making up stuff. And that's another thing it does. It shows you can't just say whatever you want to say. There is evidence for arguments about the past, and there are things that are not. Judith says, makes it easier for lower SES students to get access to data. And Melvin says it allows for accessibility. And so both those things are interesting. That seems contradictory to what some people would have told us, Annie, that lower SES students might not, you know, see archives as relevant to their lives. So it's something we'll be interested in hearing your thoughts about this. It allows for accessibility. It takes the power of history out of the hands of old school archivists who could choose what was preserved and what was discarded. Now we have more voices heard, Anne says. And that's interesting. to think about what has Ancestry and other genealogical sites have done. People who'd never thought for a moment about archives, when it's their own family, suddenly understand, wow, the whole census is out there. Okay. And it allows students, Adrian says, to encounter history as told from the time period, not just from their teachers and textbooks. And that's kind of what the Valley of the Shadow is trying to do. It's immersing people in the moment. Literally, the difference a week makes. That in Virginia, people went from strong Americans to being Confederates overnight, and to see how things can pivot in that way. I guess I'd be interested to know, those of you who haven't answered yet, or even if you have, are there particular archives that you found useful? We showed the Internet Archive yesterday, but I wonder if there's others. And Cindy, in the meantime, says, when you have a small or limited budget, using archives to show students historic concepts is essential. It allows me to use various ways of presenting a topic or concept, and it proves I'm not making things up, which I think is really important. So that's great. So are there some examples of things that you all have found helpful?
Well, one thing that when the accessibility piece that someone mentioned that you read, Ed, I was in Columbus, Ohio this summer leading a workshop, and we went to the Veterans Museum and Memorial, which is the national memorial for all veterans, which is an impressive. If you ever get to go to Ohio, Senator John Glenn was kind of behind crowdsourcing the funding for that, but they had an incredible transcribing project that you could place any document on this. It was sort of like a glass screen, like a table, and it very quickly converted handwritten letters into typed, digital form with a screen reader built in. And they were inviting veterans and their families to bring any kind of documents that were in their personal, letters that they found after perhaps a veteran passed away, or current veterans who come in and speak to school groups, journals that they kept when they were out, as recently as the conflict in Afghanistan. And it would immediately translate and with a screen reader read these aloud. So in terms of accessibility, it was pretty amazing.
Cursive writing?
Yes, it had cursive writing, and it was like transcribing it almost in real time. We were blown away. So the everybody's, kind of fighting and arguing over things like AI and that sort of thing. But in many ways, we can harness it for good. And I was really impressed with the work that they were doing there, archiving and making things accessible to a variety of not just school children, but they talked about veterans who English was not their first language. Right. And so they also had a button you could flip and it would read it in Spanish. So we were all just sort of mystified, and it was a very impressive location.
We've only gotten one response to my question. William says the Library of Congress.
Absolutely.
Archives for students. And the American Historical Association recently did a survey of what teachers use, and Library of Congress, I think, is one of the top ones. And it really is excellent, and we partner with them. The idea in the Valley of the Shadow is to, rather than having like a sheaf of these documents that you can look at, to put them in context and conversation with each other. I think that's kind of something the archives don't do. They kind of replicate the structure of the archive rather than thinking about putting these things in conversation. Well, that's good that people have not really suggested that people believe in archives generally, but it's hard apparently to think of examples of what are really good. I think, what we see with SHEG, but now digital
inquiry.
What is it?
Digital Inquiry Group, DIG. I think
Digital Inquiry Group, and Gilder Lehrman. They present kind of winnowed archives. They present primary documents from archives. But again, unlike say Bunk or Valley of the Shadow, don't put them in conversation with each other very much, except for a constrained lesson. And so we're kind of taking things out of the box, which is both exciting and also disconcerting to folks. And so that's what we're doing. So what are we doing, Annie?
So today we're going to look at the D word, and it's not democracy, it's data. And we're going to look at how you can visualize data in really creative ways to bring both a sense of place and also learning history alive in your classroom. And so today's framing question, did a nice recap and pulled some of those threads in from yesterday's chat. And today we're going to think about how we can incorporate infographics, data visualizations, and maps into your instruction. So I'm actually not going to ask you to answer this yet. This is the question I want you to be thinking about as we share with you a few different tools and resources. And then we're going to revisit this question a little bit towards the end of our discussion today when we wrap things up. So a little bit of a twist. And what made me think about this, and I don't know how many of you have seen this, it came out early in the summer. This is a joint statement from the National Science Teachers Association, the National Council for Social Studies, and 4 or 5 other organizations. They're all teacher-based organizations. And they came out with a very strongly worded joint statement, position paper on data science and the importance of teaching students how to interpret data, how to understand data, how to visualize data, and how to communicate important information based on data. Now, when in the world have we ever seen 5 organizations, particularly education organizations that are oftentimes competing for the same grants? When have we seen them come together and agree on anything? This really kind of took me by surprise, but I was pleasantly surprised given the nature of the work that Ed and I do with Bunk and with our digital scholarship lab that creates the beautiful maps we're going to look at. So I wanted you to take I just kind of pulled out to me sort of the heart of it, the bulleted items here in the center, and I have linked the entire statement into the presenter notes for you because I do want you to spend some time with that this summer as you begin to prepare for next year. But I did want to, something that really struck me, and I tried to underline them in red, talking about data science should be taught across the curriculum K-12. And a lot of times when people say K-12, they really mean 7-12, but they are actually very purposefully saying, no, we need to start with the younger grade levels. And so they talk about learning data science across subject areas, not just math. Data science is contextual and interdisciplinary. It's an investigative process using compelling questions. Does that sound like social studies? Sounds like it to me. Using data science to understand and that the experiences are for everyone, making sense of data. Civically responsible ends is the goal that they talk about. Using data for civically responsible ends. And they developed this statement through a consensus building approach. I think maybe they should share that consensus building approach to some of the people who are leading some of our, decision making about things like state standards. But I was really pleasantly surprised to see that the National Council for Social Studies was a part of that, and along with all these other content areas. And so we're going to lean into ways that data science kind of intersects with history and geography today. And I invite you at any time in the chat, you can add your thoughts on that. We can go back to that question if I want to share it with you one more time so it's in your mind. Thinking about infographics, data visualizations, and maps, how you purposefully might incorporate that into your instruction, especially given this recent push. And I know someone put in the chat yesterday, someone from Texas said Texas is really emphasizing that, as they are here in Virginia. And this is kind of evidence that it's a push across the nation. So that's what I want to kind of frame it around today, is this thinking about the importance of teaching data literacy to our students. So we're going to look at some maps today. Ed, do you want to say anything about American Panorama since you were there from the beginning?
Only to build on the comments I made at the very beginning here about the idea is that we can see the American past in a new way now because we have these mountains of data. And so we won a major grant from the Mellon Foundation for American Panorama, a digital atlas of American history. And what you'll see are a whole series of experiments of different patterns that we might see. They have 2 things in common. One, they cover the entire continent, and often Hawaii and Alaska, and that they cover vast expanses of time. you know, I think we all know that we slice and dice American history into ever smaller pieces, so that it's hard to see big patterns across time, except as progress or decline or whatever. And what these maps are trying to do is see across larger spaces, but they're also then each of them allows us to go into individual places so that it combines the microscope and the telescope that I was talking about before. There's a scale effect that all our kids have gotten used to from their phones of looking at mapping, that you can pull it back or you can zoom in. And I think the zoom effect here allows this to be very tuned to particular, and therefore it rhymes with place-based learning. At the same time, it allows people to see how where they live fits into bigger patterns. That's what these all have in common. And I'll just say one more word about it. There's been a series of very talented people who have coordinated the Digital Scholarship Lab and who have made these maps since 2007 is when we began. And they continue to evolve. And they are one of the things that Annie will show you, I think, is probably the most widely used digital historic map ever created. And it's all coming out of the University of Richmond. And again, they're all free, and they're all sophisticated, and they're all prize winning. So these are things that you can use with confidence. Thanks, Annie.
So you have a link in your slides to the American Panorama landing page here. And as you scroll down, you'll see a variety of projects. Again, no login, no password, no paywall on any of the resources and tools that we share with you. I'm going to talk about mapping inequality, and we're going to share that project, the one that Ed mentioned, which is probably the most recognizable digital humanities map, if not project, perhaps ever. It's gotten quite a lot of attention in recent years. But before we do that, I want to kind of dig into some of the other mapping projects. And the first one I want to look at is this map of forced migration. So as I mentioned yesterday and earlier today about infographics, data, and having kids take a time to learn how to use a tool. This is an infographic, and I think I can make that a little bit bigger for you. Yeah. I like the way a lot of our maps start with these beautifully crafted infographics. So when you think about visualizing data, many times our students learn concepts like bubble plots in their algebra class, but they don't really understand it because it's taught in isolation and it's not really linked to anything that's meaningful to them. What I love is the opportunity here to grab the math teacher down the hall and say, hey, we're going to be using this map this week. This would be a good time for you to pull in a lesson on bubble plots, or maybe we can coordinate this in our pacing guides together next year so that as you're teaching bubble plots and we're studying this and using this map, we can add a little context for the students. The other thing I love is that once students learn how certain tools work, the next time they see a bubble plot on another one of our maps or someone else's maps, they're already going to intuitively know how that works. And the best thing is to have them be able to explain it to another student. So I love to pause and stop on these, how to use this map infographics before just letting the kids, they always want to hit the enter and the next button too quickly, but I would say slow it down and give them a moment to kind of look at this. And then when you segue into the map, then they're going to start to see how all these tools and resources sort of fit together. So this is a map of forced migration of enslaved people. There's a timeline along the bottom here from 1810 all the way up to the 1850s. And as you go through each decade, you're going to see the map change. And so the colors here are showing the out migration, and you're seeing that also with the bubble plot down here in the bottom right. So blue, areas shaded in blue are where people are leaving, and the copper color is where people are moving towards. And every once in a while you see these little eye buttons. They're kind of hard to see. I missed them the first couple of times that I looked at some of these maps, but when I noticed them, I realized, wait, these are really important. A lot of the historical content is built into that. So give kids time to explore the map before we just tell them how it works or tell them how to use it or tell them what we want them to know about it. It's really important to give kids some time to explore. So if you look at any of our learning resources that are crafted around these maps or other maps, we always give them time to explore, find things on their own, ask questions amongst themselves before we as the adult just say, here's how this works. And they're going to remember it better, and they're going to apply that the next time they're with or without their teacher, stumbling on a map like this, maybe in another course. They're going to see these eye buttons embedded into other digital mapping projects. And quite a bit of the content that we feel like we need to teach, or it's going to be quote unquote on the test, is actually embedded into these sections. It's also a great way, as the NCSS joint statement said, to teach data literacy across the curriculum. So explaining what a bubble plot tool is here, looking for patterns that are not totally visible on the map, and then engaging their math teacher in a conversation. Hey, we looked at this map today. Have you seen this? Is a great way for kids to be able to share their understanding in more than one content area that's on their schedule that they follow. So I wanted to kind of point some of those features out. But the other thing that's really important is putting that human face and story. Much of what we do as history teachers is storytelling. And so it's not just data. It's not just looking at bar graphs or bubble plots. They've also built in these narratives, these oral histories. So as you go through each decade and you look and see these patterns, why are people leaving the East Coast? Why is everyone gravitating towards Louisiana? What is this? What's going on at this time? The eye buttons can help, but really reading these oral histories is going to provide so much context. So wherever you see a dot on the map, it's going to take you to a story. It's very much similar to the way that we looked at the Valley of the Shadow. So this is another form of an archive. Ed, do you want to say anything else about the map? Because I know you were involved in kind of the creation and some of the scholarship behind it.
No, not right now. Thanks.
Okay. Now, this project was made, I think, about 7 years ago, Ed. Is that about right?
Yeah, maybe a little bit longer.
Maybe a little longer. And so while it's a very sophisticated tool, and it's still one of, the most important ones I think that we are using with students, I want to show you sort of how far along the technology has come just in a few short years. This is Southern Journey. And so this is a story map. It's presented in an ArcGIS story map platform, which, by the way, is something that universities and corporations pay a lot of money to have access to this kind of software, but K-12 teachers and students can get it for free. So if you weren't aware of that, Esri has a K-12 program where any K-12 school can access and get district-wide and school-wide accounts to build these story maps. And I'm happy if you want to email me later to connect you to how that works. And I have some friends who can help you get started on getting your division set up with those accounts. So this is actually a collection very similar to the American Vision story map that we looked at yesterday, where each chapter we linked in the people and the travel logs and links out to the folks that Ed was talking about through each decade in American Visions. These are 3 story maps collected together. And this first one is looking starting in 1790 to 1860. So basically the same time frame as what American Visions explored. And as you scroll down, I want you to look at you can embed text, you can embed images, you can embed links, you can embed video clips. But look at how these maps can be animated to show those patterns of migration. So again, the same color scheme. Blue is where people are leaving or out migration. The gold or copper color is where people are moving towards. And this is going to compare in the beginning, the black and white population through each decade. So we start off here with the white population starting in 1790. And I want you to kind of watch how the map changes and look for what
folks said. Did someone catch the name of the program? Someone else said no. Story map.
Yes, it's Southern Journey, and there should be.
No, I think the program is.
Oh, I'm sorry. ArcGIS story map. Thanks. Great question. So this is built in a platform that is available to K-12 schools for free called ArcGIS story map.
And just to point out, those of you with us yesterday saw the story map that Annie and colleagues made for American Visions that was basically just pictures and words, right? And so that you can use it as a form of storytelling that doesn't involve heavy duty data analysis. Just want to be,
but it does have a tour. Mhm.
It doesn't
At
need to
the end of
involve
each
maps at all, right?
Yep,
Okay. So
absolutely. So there's a
it's
story map.
mapping the story. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Ed.
It's mapping a story. It doesn't really require, I think the important word is story
Right,
and
absolutely.
not map. Okay,
Yep.
you talk.
So yesterday in the story map for American Visions, at the end of each chapter, there's a map tour. That's something else that you and your students can very easily build. And I promise you, this is literally kind of the new PowerPoint / Google Slides. Story map is becoming so easy to use that it's almost like making your own set of Google Slides with a mappy twist. That's how I think of it. And it's something that kids can build up to. I've started as young as 3rd and 4th graders making their own story maps, all the way up through college and industry levels. So this is a very marketable skill. So again, we're looking at exploring those career pathways. We're also looking at the data science and the crossover between the humanities, computer science. A lot of this kind of thinking and analytical type skills are built into state computer science standards, math standards, and history standards. So watch the patterns as the blue and gold patterns of migrations change.
Just point out that, so these are divided between white population change and black population change, or free and enslaved population change. It's unusual to have both. You'll notice that's how it differs from the first project Annie showed. This has white change in it as well. And then later it has population change and people of different immigrant backgrounds as well. And so what you're seeing here is what is usually called in our textbooks expansion. And you can see it's hardly the westward flow of water that people would imagine, but it's complicated. I think, Annie, a good thing to do would be to go pretty near the end of this chapter so we can get Texas involved.
Okay.
And so it's decade by decade. I will point out that I wrote a book that was based on this. This is a powerful one. This shows you how much of the land that was the American South was occupied by Native people as late as the 1820s and 30s and 40s. And this is a way for your students, you know, one of the things I railed against in my talk in Fort Worth is the idea of removal. This shows you the great expanse and human cost of what we sort of antiseptically called removal. Okay, I asked you to go to the end, then I asked you to stop. You can thank me later.
Perfectly fine. And again, you can embed all sorts of data. Here's another. Do you want to say anything about this one, Ed?
No, that's okay.
Okay. And you have links to all of these. You can go back and explore them in more, you know, detail. But I do want to kind of get towards the end, as Ed suggested. And you'll start to see people creeping into Texas here.
Yeah.
You can also pop these out and right click them and copy them to pop them into your own slides for your students to look at, you know, be able to add them into their own projects, that sort of thing. Go ahead, Ed.
I was just going to say, so I know if you keep going down, Annie, I know that the big controversies now about the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution and the Alamo and so forth. And so being able to see here that is the black population change, and then you can scroll back over and let's look at white. And you can see that, you know, black people were being brought into Texas at the same rate, but in a more concentrated form, right? So just that's a way of showing there's not such a thing as black history and white history. They're all integrated, but just looking at Texas there to see how white people had the freedom to spread out across the beauty of Eastern Texas, while black people were concentrated in areas that were especially conducive to cotton and sugar production. In our Future America's Past thing, we visit a sugar plantation, which I think many people don't associate with Texas if you're not from Texas. Okay, keep scrolling down, Annie. We'll talk about immigration later. Let's pause here though. One of the things that you'll see is that how unusual Texas is compared to other parts of the South in its immigration before the Civil War. And all of you know about the German and Czech immigrant population there that's enriched the music and food of Texas so much. Here's a way for your kids to see just how unusual this is. The South as a whole is remarkably homogeneous compared to the North, but Texas is an anomaly within an anomaly in that case, okay? Yeah, that's just a little bit more. So people can see, you can sort of see the outpost of where cotton was growing in Texas. And you can see how that corresponds to the presence of Black people in Texas. And then this is kind of striking. What this shows is, yeah, and leave it there, Annie. The more brown a place is on this map, the more eagerly it voted to secede from the United States at the time of the Civil War. And what you can see is that Texas was the most uniformly devoted to secession compared to the Upper South in Virginia. But look along the Mississippi Delta, where we think of as being, you know, the really heart of the South, plantation districts. What this shows is a lot of big planters didn't want to secede because what they could see is that Constitution protected slavery where it was. If they created their own new nation, it would be vulnerable. In Texas, there's nobody who's an established planter in 1860. You know, Texas is new. It's, you know, as I sometimes point out, about as old as the subdivisions outside of wherever you live. That's how old Texas was at the time of the Civil War. And it turns out that we did talk about data analysis. Look at all this, and the only pattern the historians have been able to find between a statistical pattern about explains this mosaic is that population growth of white people is the best way to explain votes for secession. And this helps explain why Texas was in the lead of secession. So as you can see, this is like science. If we think back about the document that Annie showed about integrating data, this is not made like all the maps in your textbooks, I will point out, to make a point. This is just the data, okay? It was made just to reflect what the numbers show without a narrative behind it. This book that I wrote was hard because then I had to find out, how do I put that in words that are compelling, that connected to all the scholarly literature and help explain what it means. But just to show this to your students and ask them, okay, what do you think this shows about who voted for secession? I think would open up a lot of interesting questions. You'll see that probably in Texas, there's not a correlation between slaveholding and votes for secession, which is an important thing to do because people imagine that it's a one-to-one, but there's simply no correlation. Why? Because of geography. It's because things are arrayed over space. So it's just an interesting way to see. And there's Texas is going to be, Annie, maybe you could go to part 3 of Southern Journey. So while you're doing that, I'll just point out, so this was inspired by that first map that Annie showed, but I went to my friends and said, here's an insane idea. I'm going to do 230 years. Can you figure out ways to make this? And so here's a big pattern that everybody teaches, even though it's surprising in and of itself. This is the Great Migration, but shows that it's not restricted, as our textbooks have it, to World War I, but rather is in many ways, in terms of sheer numbers, just as great during World War II. And it shows that a lot of people are leaving Texas, but it also shows that Texas cities are gaining a lot of people at this time, that Houston or Dallas would be, for many people, a more logical place to migrate than Chicago or Detroit. And so you can see, how about white populations? What's the next map show, Annie?
Nope, it's all going through there. All right, we'll go down.
That's right. Keep going.
Yep, there's your
Okay.
white population.
So look at this. During World War II, the number of people who were fleeing Texas, you know, and Oklahoma. We all know about the Okies and and all this. But what this is showing too is that Texas is becoming urbanized. And I think of this as the Last Picture Show. Those of you who've seen that movie, that's what this is showing, the depopulation of a lot of small towns in Texas and people going to the big cities. So, and then just scroll down to recent past, Annie, and we'll see cool things all about the growth of the interstate. Now keep on going. Don't let me stop just because I'm interested in it. There you can see the growth of the cities of Texas in 80 to 90. And then we have another map that shows immigration that's going to show that Texas is a place, of course, with enormous immigrant presence. So the whole idea here is that this is, and you can see the maps begin with just the South because you could only map places where enslavement was embraced, understood by the census. In the 20th century, we go all the way up really to the COVID crisis. and to show all this. So I think it's something that has billions of pieces of evidence, but it's simple. People can understand. There's domestic migration, showing what all of you know, that Texas is a place where people are moving to in enormous numbers, even Elon Musk. And I think for your students to be able to see that mosaic is helpful. So
Yeah,
that's
when we were in Fort Worth, I think the mayor attended the evening when you spoke, and she said they were the fastest growing city. Wasn't that correct?
yeah, she said that in America. Yep.
America.
So there's so many different things to point out about Native people. Turns out that that's one of the fastest growing ethnicities in the United States is Native people, partly because Native people are people who can claim themselves to be Native ancestry, and that's become something people want as something that was a great danger for a long period of time. So let's stop with this, Annie, because we have other American panorama. So I will point out that Annie talked about Esri, which is the company that creates all this. My colleagues, Justin Madron and Nathaniel Ayers, won the prize for the best project in the country, actually in the world, I think, for figuring out how to do all that. My contribution was write some emails and ask them if they could. And then they figured out how to
Writing
do
the
it.
text. Come on
Yeah,
now.
well, yeah, but the story map doesn't even have text on it. And so the book, which I'll go get here in a moment, is like a coffee table book, but it's the maps that are cool, not the words. Speaking of cool maps,
I disagree, but we're going to have to agree to
okay,
disagree.
this is one of my
Plenty
favorites.
of text in there, but that's a good segue. We looked at last night, if you were with us, we were looking at the Future of America's Past, which is a PBS show that Ed hosted, and I've been delighted to be involved in writing the learning resources for each episode. And in that episode, of course, we looked at the tragic circumstances around the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and I shared this map last night, so a couple of you have already seen this. But this is a map of foreign-born population. And again, it's based on census data. It goes back from 1850 all the way up to the most recent census in 2020. So you can look at patterns both for the whole country, or what I really love is being able to dig into local data. And most of these maps, or many of these maps, allow you to start in your own zip code, your own voting district, your own county location or city, and then kind of cast that wider lens for students to start making those connections. So again, how are we using the data? How are we visualizing the data? And how are we using it for our students to make meaning? So I'm going to type in, let's see, I'm just going to type in Texas and see. All right, I'm just going to randomly pick a county or a city in Texas. I'm going to pick Hidalgo. And so this is showing you on the right-hand side, based on the most recent census, that your largest immigrant population, probably not a huge surprise, is from Mexico. But then it goes down and shows you the Philippines, El Salvador, Honduras, India, Canada, Vietnam. And so typically when I share this map, no matter what state I'm in or what grade level I'm in, immediately kids will sort of start turning and talking to each other and saying, oh, well, this is where, in many cases, these are immigrant students sitting amongst their classmates and saying, well, this is where I came from, or my grandmother still lives here. We visit her every year, or I have an aunt that still lives, in one of these places. And so it starts kind of a dialogue for students who may have sat next to each other all year and never really started that conversation. So I find that it really builds a lot of community within a classroom when you're using a map like this, particularly if you're teaching in an area with a high immigrant population, like I did in Charlottesville. And as you slide the tool back, then your students can start to look for patterns, like when did things begin to change? It's still consistently Mexico is your largest immigrant population. Has that always been the case? So far, going back to the 70s, that's true. I'm going to go back to the 1950s. No specific data exists. So a couple of times when you get that message, it could be because if that county wasn't a separate municipality, or sometimes the data has been destroyed. Sometimes something occurred in that particular area where we don't have the data readily available. And so, we do the best we can. So it looks like
that's also important for kids to understand as well, is that, as somebody pointed out about the archivist, The census, one reason I was able to make a Southern journey that I did, the only consistency in the American census from 1790 to now is race. That was the only question they asked in 1790 to 2020. I mean, in 1790 is black or white. And so that allows me to do that, but it's also a tragedy. So asking kids, where does the data come from? And maybe click on a city in Texas to.
I will, but before that, I want to point out, so after the World War II, there's a notation again, so it's important to slow down, look at the map. It talks about, and we saw this in many other cities when we've explored this map. In 1950, the foreign-born population dropped significantly, so much so that as a percentage of the total population, there wasn't statistically enough because they sort of discouraged it and stopped allowing people at certain parts in history, allowing people to come. And so if there was not enough statistical data, that can also explain. It says here that there's no foreign-born data for any states, southern states available. So that in itself is something you could dig into with your students and find out, well, why, right? So that's a great on-ramp for those sorts of discussions. Ed, what were you going to ask next? Picking another.
Choose a place in Texas with a lot of people. Just click on the map itself where it's highly colored. Choose, yeah, there you go.
Ooh.
So 1940, that is, okay, people, how were you able to change the year? She just scrolled across the bottom.
Down here, it's like a slider tool.
Yeah.
Very similar to the forced migration map.
And you can see that, and if you also, so click on Mexico in the bar chart in the upper right-hand corner, Annie, and show how that just reverse engineers. You see how she did that? She clicks on Mexico up there, and the map shifts to show you where people of Mexican ancestry live in the United States in that year, in 1910. Make it 2020 now, Annie. See? And so that's how the same data can be reversed to show different patterns. Anybody have any, so this is great, Wendy, to ask her questions. And somebody asked before about how to get to Southern Journey before Liz answered. This is a good time. I'm watching the chat, so if you have a question, I'll just pass it on to Annie. That's kind of an order like that, but she'll know that it's from other people. So the amount of information here is pretty stunning, and the fact that my colleagues are able to figure out how to show this in such a way is remarkable. And it gives the kids a chance, you know, what big controversial subject these days is immigration, but people don't really have any idea of why is this a topic now. But, you know, looking at that graph across the bottom, people can see how, because of different policies, you know, 1965 is the act that sort of encourages immigration now. You can start seeing that building, but also how Texas compares to the other places and how county can differ from the one next door to it as well. So this is a great example of not only place-based down to a county, but it goes globally to the whole world and ties the United States into these patterns. So you could use this basically in everything that you teach from 1850 to the present, you know, with 10 minutes to talk about, immigration restriction in the 1920s. You call up this map, you can show its consequences, right? But you know, so in talking about the Vietnam War and how it is that the ideas of immigration changed in that time, you can show it. So that's one of the things we want to talk about later, right, Andy? We want to ask about how people might incorporate things. So I'll stop now, so you'll be able to continue.
All right. So are there questions?
Fired up. Thinking about data gets my juices flowing here.
I know, that's great. Are there any questions in the chat we need to address, Ed, before we move on to?
Just thanks.
All right. So again, I want to revisit our question. We've looked at a couple of different maps. So I want you to keep thinking now that we've, looked at Southern Journey and we've looked at foreign born. So how are you thinking about data? How are you thinking about infographics? How are you visualizing data? How might you embed those maps in your instructions? So I want you to keep thinking about that. You can start adding some thoughts in the chat now as we move into other maps, and we'll keep revisiting that question. So going back to American Panorama, hopefully. So here's our home. Whoop. Okay, here we go. Here's our home page. And so all of the maps you can find a couple of different ways. Someone said, how did you get to that? So many of the maps are here on American Panorama on their homepage. The digital scholarship lab that creates those does have some additional maps like Southern Journey. So if you are looking for the maps, you can also always go back to our homepage. We shared this yesterday. Everything we looked at under journalism, you can find bunk. Under audio, you can find podcasts. Under video, you can find the Future of America's Past, like the screening event we held last night. Maps gives you access to American Panorama right here. Also, other maps like Southern Journey that weren't part of that digital atlas project that Ed mentioned was funded by the Mellon Grant. So other maps are here, and we showed you how you can map out content placed in bunk. Because Southern Journey is based on the book that Ed wrote before American Visions, we also have a separate scholarship tab. And so when you go under the scholarship tab, everything we shared for American Visions yesterday is located here, and everything for Southern Journey is located. So you've got multiple ways to find it. The other thing I do want to point out is all of our maps, all of the episodes of the Future of America's Past, many of the Backstory podcast episodes are embedded in bunk. So if I were to search for Southern Journey, if I could type, when I type in Southern Journey, you will see there's the map. And when you select that, now you're going to, the link says video, but it's really going out to the story map. And then you can also see how Southern Journey and the content within that digital mapping project is related to other topics that we explored yesterday in bunk, right? And so thinking again about visualizing data, using infographics, using maps, how do you embed that in your instruction? Having this keyhole in through bunk then explores those wider connective topics that you're teaching anyway on your syllabus. So lots of different ways to get to the maps. All of the maps we're going to look at today are also embedded in bunk, as well as being available on our homepage using the menu across the top. All right, so I do want to share, I used to say probably the most widely known, but now I just say everybody has pretty much seen this map at this point. There are very few of us who have not heard the term redlining. It's become a huge topic of discussion. It's in the news every week. I get 4 to 7 Google alerts because I have a Google alert set for anytime anyone is using one of our maps or one of our projects, publishing it, citing it in a reference journal, a newspaper article, a TV, news broadcast. And a lot of museums, we've partnered with so many museums across the country who have been looking at the topic of redlining in their own local history. Kansas City Museum did a beautiful exhibit. The Norfolk State and the Modern Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia Beach did an exhibit on redlining last year that we were able to partner with them. We're going to be in Alabama this coming fall talking about museums and how we've partnered with them using these maps. So this is the third version of mapping inequality, which many people refer to as the redlining map. The map was recently redone in December. So even if you had seen it before, and if you haven't checked it out since December, it's a whole new map. So when I click on explore the map, you're going to notice that there are these bullseye looking symbols, and they vary in size. And if you look down here on the bottom left, there's a little bit of an explanation about the different types of markers. And you notice down here, we've added so many of these orange circles that if you had looked at the map previously, those weren't there before. Previously, when you used to log into this map, all you saw were the cities that had the bullseye type markers. Much of the middle part of the United States had nothing or very few. The infographic that we looked at on the other foreign born map, this is expanded into a whole different section because this map has so many intricate working parts. And so we couldn't do it justice just on a simple infographic. We had to make a whole separate tab because this map digs into some very complex ways to represent the data. But in a nutshell, the areas that were on the original map, the bullseye looking markers, are representing cities which during the late 30s and early 40s, FDR's administration formed what's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was a federal program designed to pull cities out of the economic depression, and to give banks and lenders a little bit of guidance on where they could safely make loans and try and make homes more affordable, but also make sure that they were going to get a return on their investment. The cities in orange are not part of that federal program, but many state and local governments formed similar lending practices based on that federal program. So we invited cities that had discovered local maps or statewide maps that were not part of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but showed similar patterns. We invited them to scan and send those to us. And that's why we suddenly have 100 new cities or places represented on the map. So when I go out into the map, I'm going to close the markers. I'm going to type in Texas. And you'll see here that there were many of those larger cities that we explored in Southern Journey or on the foreign born map, Houston, Dallas, Austin. Those were part of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but now we've been able to add some of these other locations that weren't previously included, like Galveston and Port Arthur and Waco. So when we look on the map here, I'm going to kind of show you the difference. Here's the map of Fort Worth, where Ed and I were recently invited to see some of you. And when you log in, you're going to get a digital scan of this primary source document. This is the original map that was made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You notice over here, this color-coded key, areas in green, and when you hover over the map key, they're actually going to light up and show you where those areas are. These were the areas that were deemed the best. Think of these as your upper to wealthier class neighborhoods. Blue is what we would nowadays think of as your upper middle class to middle class suburban neighborhoods, still desirable is how they're coded. Yellow are areas that are coded as definitely declining, and areas in red, which they were the largest portion, were deemed hazardous. So during the late 30s and early 40s, much of Fort Worth was deemed hazardous. And if you click on any individual neighborhood, it's going to give you a little bit more information about those neighborhoods. One other thing we added is contextual essays. These are developed by scholars. We invited scholars around the country to kind of bring these maps to life. We aren't from all of these cities, so our team could only do but so much in the interpretation. So why not reach out to the experts, the geographers, the historians, the public historians, the historians on the ground who have either grown up there or taught there and are intimately familiar with the history and the geography of those communities. And so everywhere that you see geographic reference, that's going to also be highlighted on the map. When it talks about red outlined areas of East Downtown, it visualizes that for the students. The Armour and Swift meatpacking plant, it's going to show the students on the map exactly what part of town they're talking about. So these essays that we've added, I feel, is what we really bring the history to life. There's the Fort Worth stockyards, which I visited when I was there. And so in each city where we've been able to find a scholar who is willing to join in on this effort, we're able to provide that historic context to your students. Many of the scholars embedded other images, smaller maps, historic maps, and they all included some recommended reading and sources that they used in forming that essay.
And they're signed, which is an important thing. These scholars are taking responsibility for the things that they say.
Now, the data is not all complete. So for example, on this map, we don't have the individual scan documents that led to giving us some other population data. So we can go out and look for another city. So not every city is going to have exactly the same data. If I go back and look at a different city in Texas, I'm going to try Dallas this time. Here we see that when I click on that city, we have a little bit more data involved in that one. So when I zoom in on that, let me put Dallas up here. Okay, Zoom seems to be going a little slow. Okay, come on, you can do it. There we go. not wanting to move, but sometimes it's my internet connection, so I apologize. I'll move on to this feature and we'll see if the map catches up. In many of the cities, you can get what are they called the area descriptions. These are primary documents that were used to sort of score and grade the neighborhoods on that color-coded system. We added a new keyword search, very similar to what we saw when we were looking at the Internet Archive yesterday. So originally I thought, well, let's look at immigration. So I typed in immigration. And it said there were only 4 places that cited immigration. And I was like, what? That makes no sense. And then I realized at the time when this was being, orchestrated, people didn't call them immigrants. They didn't call it the immigrant population. What was that last map called? Foreign born. So when we typed in foreign born, oh, now there's 612 matches. And it maps out for you over here on the left how many times that word foreign born or that phrase was mentioned in the green neighborhoods. Remember, those were the best, those were the wealthiest. Very few mentions of immigrant or foreign born in the green neighborhoods. Likewise with the blue, a few more, yellow, and then red. So this is a way for your students to sort of analyze the data of where were the immigrants or foreign born population living in the late 30s and early 40s, and how did that influence the choices that the lenders made when they were scoring those neighborhoods. And then it will, as you scroll down, you can see there was all across, the country where this was a pattern. So this keyword search I found to be like a really interesting way to engage the students. I'm going to see if I can pick a different city, see if the map
While
will
you're
be
doing that, I'll say something, Annie.
Yep.
Is that this shows you like basically every piece of evidence, every data, that the numbers don't speak for themselves. I mean, who made these categories of best, desirable, definitely declining, and so forth, and what do they mean? They're highly racialized, of course. And so that's useful so your kids don't sort of just because it's a map or a number or a graph, take it for granted, take it as gospel truth. So while this does show the way that neighborhoods were graded, there's no doubt about that. It then raises also the question, well, who graded them and why, and what did they mean? And then that is even in a larger box, is that what was the purpose of all this, which was actually to encourage home loans. So this was designed to be economic development, but then it ends up sort of inscribing racial identities and anti-immigrant identities, basically penalizing poor people for living where they do. For a good purpose, but then it has the effect then being used by real estate companies to prevent people from getting loans. So, it shows how good intentions can end up in different kinds of actions, but it also shows how the idea of a completely transparent number, especially when it involves people of any kind, has to be interrogated as something to be thinking about in and of itself. I see that as a learning opportunity rather than just a deficiency. It is kind of what the data is.
So in clicking on a few different cities in Texas, I don't see any of the area description documents, which means perhaps those who were charged with scoring these neighborhoods across the state of Texas either didn't use the template, which was provided and encouraged, or they have not been found. They have not been discovered in other archives. And we have seen this in pockets across the country. These maps were sort of buried in the National Archives for many decades. Some people surmise that perhaps the federal government was embarrassed about the way that, as Ed mentioned, these became a racialized entity in themselves. But we do have scanned documents for other parts of the country. I do want to show you an example of that. So I'm just going to pick on our own backyard here with Richmond, just so you can see an example of how a scanned document would be embedded. This is my old neighborhood along Monument Avenue, which has been in the news quite a bit in recent years as we debated over the removal of Confederate statues and fair housing. And so this is the neighborhood that I used to live in when I first started teaching. And you notice here we have a button that we didn't have on the maps in Texas. So when you look at the scanned document, this is the original primary source. This is the template that the Homeowners Loan Corporation provided to every banker, realtor, lender, title agency, people that they sort of deputize to score these neighborhoods. And in the clarifying remarks is where they sort of think through and narrate how they came to the decision. And so, for example, in my old neighborhood, they mentioned that this was, you know, the concentration of wealth for many decades, but then they talk about how the peak has passed and how this used to be a boulevard with monuments to Confederate celebrities.
I love
Now,
the phrase Confederate celebrities.
yeah, that was an eye opener for sure with my students. But it talks about the offspring of these homes, meaning as the population was aging, these large mansions that used to be where, you know, the wealth of Richmond was concentrated were converted to apartments, which is what I lived in. It used to be a single family home and we had 8 apartments smushed into that building. And that for that reason, they downscored it to yellow. So lots of interesting information you can tease out on these. It's unfortunate that we don't have the scanned documents for most of the cities in Texas, but that's why those essays are even more valuable, I think, for those of you joining us here today, because before we didn't have the scanned documents, well, at least now, if I can, you know, you can go through some of the area. Oh, wait, we found one. Dallas does have some. Oh, hooray. I would clicked on like 5 other cities. There you go. You've got one for Dallas. So I'm not as familiar with the Dallas area. Do we have any Dallas teachers here? If you're familiar with it, maybe you can give us a little bit of your take on this. But it talks about Jefferson Avenue, largely business, intersecting with, you know, they mentioned a couple of other streets in that area. The area is composed of almost every type of property, good, bad, and indifferent. As a whole, the part of the area of North Jefferson is better than the part of South Jefferson. So when you go back to the map, that area was coded yellow, but it hinges right next to a green and blue area, which were considered, you know, desirable and the best, but it also on the other side. And as they mentioned, you know, they've got the red and yellow neighborhoods kind of surrounding it too.
So Jared tells us Jefferson Avenue is an area that was once prosperous, but took a dive, which lasted a long time and is now making a comeback now.
So that's a great
Renee
segue.
says South Jefferson is made up of a large minority populations.
Yep.
So
that's a good place to move on, Ed. Go ahead.
Nope.
I was going to move on to the next map. So here's the rub. And I don't know if Dr. Hayter, our colleague Julian Hayter, is with us again today. He was with us yesterday, but Julian wrote a brilliant essay for us that, and you can find it in Bunk. And it kind of talks about how redlining is just the beginning or only part of the story. And so I'm going to see if I can pull that up as I talk a little bit about this next period of history known as urban renewal. A lot of times we sort of get stuck in redlining, and it's really easy to blame everything on policy decisions that were made in the 30s and 40s. And well, we weren't even alive back then. I'm not the one that made those decisions. But as we saw with some of those orange dots, smaller local, state, and local governments built in policies like racially restrictive covenants that did not allow families of color to move into those blue and green neighborhoods. And so when you look at all of the content on redlining, and I would start with this essay, and I will link that into the slides, or you can search for Dr. Hayter on Bunk. He's written several excellent pieces for us. But looking at how right here, we talked about how you can share just one connection. Looking at that article connected to the map itself, all of these different subtopics that your students can explore through Bunk and through the maps, and going back and looking at those essays. But the next part of the story, as Julian writes about, not that one. The next part of that story is going to, apologies, the map did not open the way I wanted it to. Let's see if I can get it to open now. Here we go. There we go. So in the 50s and 60s, we have this next phase known as urban renewal. And again, we'd like to start with an image for your students to analyze. This is a woman being dragged from her home in Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles. I've used this with students in California. The land that her apartment or her home was on is where Dodger Stadium now sits. So many of these projects, again, we start with these infographics so you can show students how data is going to be visualized. And when you get to this map, and I'm going to see if we can pull up Dallas again. When we get to this map, I'm just going to click on the map. We'll start with San Antonio. Here is a map of where urban renewal projects came along. So in this next phase, federal funding was given to cities where they quote unquote had blighted or slum areas. So areas that we saw it shaded in yellow and red were typically the areas that were targeted. And also this is the same time where the interstate highway system is starting to be built across. And if you were part of that homeowners loan corporation, not all of the places that are on the urban renewal map, it's not a one-to-one match. There are many additional cities that were part of this urban renewal, but if they were part of the homeowners loan corporation, we've added that layer underneath so you can see. So where did the highways go through? They largely went through the red and yellow neighborhoods. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Ed?
Nope.
Okay, so as you're going through, again, we can't just keep blaming redlining on the 30s and 40s. We have to hold some responsibilities to later policy decisions that were made by state and local leaders during this period of urban renewal. We have to hold accountable the people who allowed those restrictive covenants to say, no, even if you save up money and you want to buy a house in the blue and green neighborhood, you're not allowed to, because only these families are allowed to live there. Only white families can buy a home in Shady Acres or Sunny Farms or whatever your subdivision was named. And one of the programs that is most often requested that I zoom in with classes all around the country, and I will base it on the maps for your locality. So I'm not giving the same presentation over and over. I personalize it for your zip code. I research what were the restrictive covenants, if there were any. And we look at the advertisements and we look at the wording in some of these documents. And then we dig into the maps and we look at images from those neighborhoods. And I don't tell the kids what they're looking at in the first 15 to 20 minutes of the workshop. I'm giving them the sources, they're analyzing them, they're discussing among themselves. And then I leave the takeaway deck for them and their teacher to do further exploration. And it's one of the most powerful programs that I think that we offer. And I think it's important for kids to kind of dig into their own local history and see how this all played out in their own backyard. Now, a lot of people will still kind of stop with urban renewal. And this map has a story map built in and has video content. It has a whole legislative piece if you're teaching government, talking about the local policies. So if you look along this menu, there's lots of other additional content added. This is a brilliant story map that kind of brings urban renewal to life. It's embedded right in the map. It's got video content, images, analysis, similar to what we saw in Southern Journey. So I really encourage you to spend some time digging into this one. But the story still doesn't stop there, because we know that in the modern era, so the next map, not even past, this is based on just the Homeowners Loan Corporation, so not the urban renewal maps. But if you scroll down here, for every city that was scored in that original Homeowners Loan Corporation, you're going to see kind of a where are they now. And so what they've done here is on the left, you've got the original scan document. Okay. We'll try that again. Maybe we'll have better luck with Houston. There we go. Okay, so you've got your scan document here on the left. Okay. And on the right is sort of a where are they now? How would that neighborhood be scored today if you were to use those similar metrics? And then it also, we didn't have an area description, but if you did have one of those onion skin documents that we zoomed in on, like I showed you with my apartment in Richmond, that data would be here. But we do have public health data in the modern era. So students can kind of analyze, if you were in a red or a yellow neighborhood in the 1930s and 40s, how would they score that neighborhood today? And so some of these areas that are white or gray, those were industrial. They didn't even have housing there at the time. So some of these areas have grown, and apartments or lofts or subdivisions have been built in areas, where there weren't people living before. But if you look, oftentimes you'll see that in the red and yellow neighborhoods, you're having higher incidence of things like diabetes and heart disease, mental health issues, high blood pressure. And so it's a way that they can kind of compare the past and the present in those spaces. I'm going to pause there for a minute. Are there questions in the chat? I'm going to see if we can bring up Dallas.
I think
now.
people are just absorbing all this, Annie.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
and-
look at how this moves. When I'm in the yellow neighborhood, if you look at today's metric, portion of that is now would be considered in the green. So that's when you can bring in vocabulary and concepts like gentrification, but some of it is moved from the yellow down to the red, meaning it's gotten even worse in terms of the value of those properties. Ed, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that these maps show engagement and relevancy in very immediate ways and local, right? So that ties together a lot of the things that we're talking about. And again, these are, the numbers on the right are generated by in current, these are not projection of the past. This is actually social health index that are social vulnerability score. I don't remember any, is that a government generated number?
It is, I believe, yes. And
Yeah.
again, all of the maps, we give you the data sets. One thing that I really love about the GIS community as a whole is Esri, if you're using their software, they don't allow you to hoard the data. You've got to make that data publicly accessible. Now, if you have a paid account and you collect the data yourself, it's up to you to choose if you want to share that data. We always do. And all of our maps are under Creative Commons license, just like Bunk and just like Southern Journey and all the other projects that we do. We put it out there with the understanding that as long as you're not monetizing it, you're free to use it for educational purposes or to share in community-wide meetings. We have a lot of communities that are grappling with fair housing now, and they have used these maps and used the social vulnerability index as evidence to take to their local policymakers and say, look, this is what's happened in the past, but we don't have to be stuck that way. And here's what we can do to find a path forward. And that's why I really love having a way to visualize this data and letting kids drill down to specific neighborhoods.
Yeah, I was invited to speak to the Richmond Realtors Association, who were very interested to see all this and think about the good that does for them to understand, how it is that these neighborhoods came to be. I want to make sure, Annie, that we get to your.
Yep, that was my segue.
Yep.
Yep. So the last map in the series, and then we're going to dig into the learning resources that go along with these maps and some other learning resources. As you guys were joining in today, Liz and I were chatting about the extreme heat that we're seeing all across the country. We've seen many more wildfires in the recent years. And so this is a story map called The Lines That Shape Our Cities. Now, this does not have all of the 147 original Homeowners Loan Corporation map cities on it. This one is more of a case study. So it's built in the story map platform. And it also is linked in here through Bunk, so you can get to all the other content that's related. So when you view this on American Panorama, it's going to take you out to the story map, but I want to show you that it is connected in Bunk. And I want to show you a very powerful image. I use this similar to what we did with the paintings yesterday. I want you to watch. This is animated in ways similar to what we saw with Southern Journey, but this is a very powerful image. So I want you to look at this for a moment. And in the chat, I want you to tell me, what do you see? What does it make you think about? What does it make you wonder? Because we've used that strategy yesterday, but I want you to apply it now to this image. And keep in mind our question about visualizing data and using maps in your instruction and data literacy. Liz and Ed, you'll have to let me know if people are responding.
I'll let you know. There we go. Liz says it shows attitudes to different areas and how they are developed.
Hmm.
So I've got so far. I see a lot of words associated with the development of cities, Jared says.
Yep.
It shows the negative aspects of an area, Jesus says. A view of what replaces green spaces, Cindy says.
Anyone familiar with how you think we made this image?
No guesses, apparently. Oh, here we go. Evaluative descriptions of an urban area. It almost reads like someone making notes on an area, Kathy says. Nice homes in the green. I'm sorry, that was Rachel who says that. Kathy says, nice homes in the green. Blue is probably rural. Red is less desirable. Gold is middle class.
So do you remember those onion skin papers that I showed you on some of the cities that we found, and the keyword search when I search for words like foreign born or immigration? What this is representing is we took all of the area descriptions for all 147 cities across the United States and dumped them into a word cloud. And those of you who have used word clouds before know the bigger the word means, the more often it's mentioned. So the larger words that you see here, and they are color coded with those homeowners loan corporation color keys. So remember, green was best. You've got shade and golf courses and shrubbery and landscaping and playgrounds and woods, right? Blue was considered still, desirable, and it's wooded and landscaped. A little bit of industry, but lots of trees and plants and shrubberies, paved sidewalks and golf clubs. Yellow was declining, high immigrant populations. You start seeing words like odor, obnoxious, airports, dumps, pavement, floods, hazardous, canals, manufacturing, railroads. And then the red, sewers, odors, treeless, industry, packing, highways, airports. And so this is a visualization of all of those area descriptions. This is not a map of any real place, but I have used this as a See, Think, Wonder before I share any of the maps that we just looked at with students. And then we look at this image and we visit it again. And it's I find it a very powerful teaching tool. I can send you an image that doesn't have the words in front of it, or I can actually link that image here into the slides. I'll do that when we conclude today, so that you have a good view of this particular image. But I wanted to share
Liz Edlin described, before you said all that, extra credit for Liz, who says
extra credit
mashup of a word cloud and map.
Yep.
That's as concise a description as you could possibly get. So
absolutely. So this is a case study where they just picked 4 cities across the United States to look at the environmental impact. So putting those major highways, running them through red and yellow neighborhoods, showing how it involved the property values. As you can imagine, the red and yellow neighborhoods continue to be devalued. The green and blue neighborhoods are worth even more. Also looking at the public health data, people living next to the highways, using what's called the urban heat island effect, which is when you don't have trees and you have mostly pavement, like what we're experiencing this summer, you have more incidents of heat stroke, heat exhaustion, higher levels of melanoma. And so they're looking at these 4 cities across the country as a case study, relating it to climate change and the way that red and yellow neighborhoods were kind of predetermined based on these policies that were made to suffer the greatest consequence. So I wanted to kind of share the maps as kind of a 4-part story arc, not just to illustrate how data can be visualized, how we can use it to tell a story, but I also wanted to kind of lean into our learning resources. So for every tool and resource we've shared with you over the last 2 days, we've looked at American Visions, we've looked at Bunk, we've looked at maps, we've looked a little bit at episodes of the Future of America's Past, we looked at Valley of the Shadow. We're creating learning resources for all of these topics, and we're looking to expand that learning resource library. So I did a search within our learning resources library earlier this morning. I just typed in the word redlining. You can do a keyword search, or you can search by a topic. So if there's something that you're teaching next week, but I had put in redlining, and all of the lessons that touch on any of the maps that we just showed you. And what we try and do is have leveled versions of these. So you're going to find that we have ones that are appropriate for middle and a general high school course. So basically 7th through 10th, 11th grade. And then we also have AP level resources for those of you who are teaching students at a little bit of a more rigorous level. Embedded into for each of these maps. So you're going to find sort of 2 versions for each one. And then there's a very basic general one that's been updated to help you navigate the original, the mapping and equality map itself. So you don't have to be a GIS expert. We give you step-by-step directions. I'm going to pull up the learning resource, the basic one that goes along with mapping and equality in its most current iteration. The student version, as we shared yesterday, includes just the activities themselves and the vocabulary, because kids don't really need, they don't need the things like the standards and the teaching tips, but we do embed those in there for your benefit, especially thinking of novice teachers who might not have background knowledge themselves on certain topics. My internet seems to be going slow. I apologize. Here we go. So in the teacher tips, we're going to talk to you a little bit about different teaching strategies that we use, how to navigate the map, a short video that you can choose to share with your students or just watch for your own background knowledge. All of that's kind of embedded into the learning resource. And then we're going to give you screenshots and step-by-step directions to help you and your students navigate the map. We do use that 5E's inquiry strategy. So asking, again, before we tell the students what the map's about and how it works, just giving them time to explore the map, asking them questions like, how can maps help us visualize segregationist housing policies in the New Deal era? So click on explore the maps and let them have 10 or 15 minutes to explore the tool before we start to spoon feed any of that information. Having kids look through all the different ways that the map is, data is visualized, the context behind it, the policy pieces that are laid out in there. So giving them step-by-step directions, showing them how to locate all these different places, but letting them dig into it with a partner rather than us giving them the information that we want them to pass a test or that's in the AP syllabus. So each of those learning resources is available for you to pull up. You can use them in whole, you can use them in part. As we mentioned yesterday, I wanted to share one of the learning resources that goes along with American Visions, because someone last night, as I was going through the chat, asked about teaching primary and secondary sources. AI is a hot topic right now. Some schools are thinking about banning it, others are embracing it. The workforce is saying, explain what it is and let's break it down so students as they enter the workforce know how to use it responsibly. So that's exactly what we did in this particular learning resource. We looked at Ed's travel piece on going to visit Walden Pond. We pulled up the Internet Archive and had students read some original excerpts from Walden. And then we asked AI, ChatGPT, to rewrite some of those passages. And I apologize for my internet, folks. Apparently we're having a little problem out here in rural Fluvanna County today, but we're having students talk about different types of primary sources and then having ChatGPT rewrite them and then letting students compare. How does Henry David Thoreau write compared to ChatGPT rewriting it and leveling those passages? We did them on a 7th and 11th grade reading levels for students to compare. And I'm so sorry that the internet is giving us a fit today.
Well, that's all right, Andy, because partly we want to use our last time, I think, to hear from folks. You can see how cool this is, though. I'll not intervene, but I'll just say we're getting ready to turn to you and ask your advice about how we make this as useful to you as possible, and what obstacles you might face in using them. So I don't know if that's selfish or selfless that we're going to do that. Is there something else you'd like to show, Annie, before we?
No, I think that's a great place, especially considering my internet's being
That was part of the
misbehaved.
reasons I was doing that. So
Absolutely.
I don't know if we'd like to, do we want to switch on video, Liz? And let people just say what they would like to say?
Sure, we'd love for everybody to turn on their video and engage in the conversation right now. So I'll encourage everyone to do that.
So you could do us a favor by giving us advice about how we can make this most useful to you. Something else you might like to see us make, or some other way to adapt this. I see everybody coming on. Thank you so much. All the faces of people who've written such great comments. So because I would say you'll notice that we are not like SHEG or GLI, that we're not making things that kind of fit into standards and curriculum in a kind of modular sort of way, if that is a fair characterization of them. And I say this not in criticism of them, but to say what we are doing that's different and what we're doing. And so but what that means is that people aren't exactly sure sometimes of how to use these things. So what advice do you have for us of any sort, of a criticism or encouragement or a suggestion? And Russell writes in, one of the things I noticed, there's so much of it, exclamation point. Is there an entry point from which we can search for a single topic across Bunk and the other resources? Annie, I'll just go ahead and direct that to you to answer.
Will you read that one again for me?
There's so much of it.
I know there's so many.
Is there an entry point from which we can search for a single topic across Bunk and the other resources?
Well, I would say Bunk is the best place to start because it connects so many of the other resources. So for example, when I type in redlining, you're going to get all 4 of those maps are going to come up. You're going to get the pieces that Julian and other scholars have written. So I would say Bunk is the best place to start with that. The other thing is going across that menu of choices on the homepage or exploring it through a keyword search in the Learning Resources Library to see if we already have partnered with a teacher like yourselves to create a lesson. So those are 3 different ways to kind of jump into a topic.
I guess I would actually reverse the order of those, Annie, if I were you. Again, thinking about how do we make this useful to teachers, I would begin with the Learning Resources to see things that have already been sort of thought through and framed. So that's what I would say, Russell. And Annie made them. So this is probably just modesty on her part to do that. So
made them with a lot of help with people like our friends here today. So
yeah, but Russell's first comment is the main thing, is a strength is also a weakness. There's so much of it, exclamation point. Right. And so the whole idea is multiplicity, all the different ways of seeing the past. I would say generally historians tend to be very word-based, and then maybe some maps that are state level red blue things. I helped write a history textbook, and I really hated the way the maps and graphics are very, they just reinforce what we already think rather than offering new opportunities. So I think that first sentence is the important one. There is a lot of it. How do we make it useful? What else we got? Anybody like to speak?
So I feel the same way. Like there's a lot that was just kind of thrown. And one of the things that I think Annie said yesterday, like it feels kind of overwhelming, like all the things that we've been shown. And so maybe just some other, like she suggested yesterday, like having the kids go on Bunk, and just like what kind of jumps out at them. And I was just wondering if there's any other kind of more of those practical suggestions on like incorporating it in the classroom, to get like our feet wet and kind of get us using it and get the kids using it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I employ that same strategy with each of the maps, you know, where I suggest instead of us starting right off with a lesson or telling them here's how the map works, just giving them the map itself and giving them some time to explore and ask each other questions, put them up with a partner. A lot of times what I'll do is have kids sitting side by side with a laptop. Maybe one of them has the map up, and then one of them has one of the documents that's linked, or one of the contextual essays, for example, with the redlining map. So as they're reading the essay, the other person can be, kind of navigating the map, or letting them each explore a map and then turn and talk to a partner and discuss, well, what did you find interesting, or what did you think about this? And then answering each other's questions, and then opening that up to a whole group. So I think it needs to be inquiry based at all levels, whether you start with a map, whether you start with a letter or a diary in the Valley of the Shadow, whether you start with an episode of The Future of America's Past, watching just a segment, 4 or 5 minutes clip, and then letting them talk and discuss it. And all of the inquiry-based 5Es lessons are sort of built that way, right? It's very little teacher talk, and it's more them kind of moving through the resources on their own, but you're there, obviously, to answer questions and guide them, and make sure that they get the main points. And that's where
I heard Rachel suggesting something different, which is we begin with the particularity of a kind of source. And I heard Rachel say 4 teachers actually suggest here is a way to teach a particular topic that would tap into that would an overview of this, rather than a series of different kinds of things that we can do, rather begin with an integrated approach. Rachel, does that seem a fair statement of what you were suggesting?
Yeah, that too. Both of y'all are kind of hitting on like what I was saying. Because like I said, it's like really great tools, like it's really cool. But also there's a little bit of like, oh my gosh, like what am I going to do with this? Like kind of an overwhelming, like,
Yep.
okay, how do I incorporate this? So, but yeah, both of what you're saying, like kind of what am I going to do with it?
I would say lean into that read for understanding section, the teacher tips. And because that's really written in mind for someone who's maybe not as familiar with that particular content, or the technology tools, whether it be Bunk or a map. And so I would say spending a little time on our own, sort of getting familiar to where we feel comfortable sharing it with our class. And that's why I like to do sessions like this in the summer. We're a little more relaxed, maybe tonight or tomorrow night, you just pick one map and kind of explore it. And then next week, maybe you say, I'm going to block out this 45 minutes to just explore Bunk. I'm going to pick a topic that usually doesn't go well when I get to that unit. Unit 3 is always, oh, they never like Unit 3, or they never seem to get Unit 3. Well, let's see what we have in Bunk that pertains to Unit 3. Could I make it 10% more interesting or engaging, right? Or could one of the maps maybe make the kids see themselves in the story? And so maybe just chunk it that way in the time you've got between now and when school starts, so it's not so overwhelming. And also, I don't expect anyone to implement all of these in the same school year. Pick 1 or 2 things and work with it. And then maybe the next semester you pick 1 or 2 more. And then, within a couple of years, you'll have kind of this whole arsenal of tools in your teacher toolkit that you can use and share with colleagues. I hope that's helpful.
A couple of things. Kelly asked a good question that's actually, I wish I had a better answer for. She says, is there a resource that dates earlier than 1760s? And I would say kinda, but I would say that partly because American Panoramas relies on American census data, on things we can actually map, which starts no earlier than 1790. There's a tendency of 19th, 20th, and 21st century stuff. It's weaker on the colonial period. So I think that's a fair way of saying that. And Eddie says, can't get my video to turn on, but I'm so excited to explore these resources. My planning mode is in hyperdrive, thinking of what I can add to lessons and areas. Thank you, thank you. So that's really good. Mona says, I think we just need time to explore everything so we can find ways to use it. Great advice, Annie. Use bits and pieces each year. And I think that's, I would just point out that Annie and I are so excited about all these cool things that we to share. It may be that we need to think about bits and pieces too, Annie. because what we want to do is lay out the whole menu for you. Nobody eats the entire buffet table. And so maybe to think about how do we make meals out of all this would be something that we can learn from all this. I want to make sure that we've now used time. Jared also says these tools are awesome. Thanks for everyone's hard work, and thanks to the team at Humanities Texas for putting this all together. And so I think that's where I would like to end, is thanking Liz.
I want to ask a question to you,
Oh.
Mr. Ayers.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for all the resources. This has been amazing. I can't wait to see what we can do with it in the classroom. But while we have all you guys here, being that we're coming into teaching in a election year semester, do you have any advice for how to, I guess, approach, take an authentic approach to teaching history, without coming up, I don't know. I mean, when you look at the homepage of Bunk, there's some touchy things. I teach in a pretty conservative district, and I always try to approach it very neutral, but do you have any words on that?
Yeah, as it turned out, I just spoke to 50 state legislators across the country last week, and we just leaned into all of this. First of all, I would say that Bunk, I think, is better for you than for your students sometimes,
Yeah.
right? And so just go in, and one principle we have, so we don't label our stuff with any political objective. We're not teaching for justice or whatever, right? So one thing about this is we understand that you need to be able to show anybody who asks, what are you teaching and why, right? And so that's why we're emphasizing data and the transparency for all that. So I think that's a smart move. Personally, we work really hard at Bunk to make sure it's as politically representative as possible, but there's just a lot more publications that are taking what we might think of as a liberal perspective on it. And historians, our nature is often questioning. And if it doesn't have a political agenda, people can imagine one just because we're asking questions about it, right? So I would say be careful is my first advice. But the other thing is to ways that are appropriate to your own students, acknowledge that what it is that we're talking about here. Why do some people think this? And why do some people think that? Sort of take it out of the box as the thing itself so that people don't just interpret it as people's motives, our opinion and bias and all this. And just to say, okay, right now, actually through most of American history, people have disagreed about what the lessons of the past are. And we're going to look at that now. We're going to actually lead with that. Everybody should feel free to say what they want to say. I'm not trying to tell you what to think, but if we don't acknowledge that there are disagreements about this, we can't really make advice. So I always say that classrooms are communities of trust that teachers create. You are accruing that every day with the good things that you do. So I would just say level with your students to say that you're not taking sides, but let's talk about this a little bit. How would we know if this is a portrayal of the past? Now, it's easy for me to say, back in the day, I could say anything I wanted to in college and not get in trouble. I don't know what it would be less so today, but we see ourselves as friends and allies of teachers. The last thing we want to do is present something that causes undue difficulty for you. But I think, and this is something Annie's taught me, kids understand more than we think. You already know this. And just putting it out there as something that we're talking about without me trying to indoctrinate you with something, I think can take a lot of the air out of the spirit. So that's my own advice. I'd say state legislators, we're also using sort of the same slogans on different sides, right? And try to say, let's don't use a slogan. Let's just look at this issue and think what we're trying to say. So that's my advice, William, if that's of any value. But if we hide it, it actually just makes it worse. But talk about it in a respectful way.
Thank you.
Speaking of respectful, I want to respect people's time. We've now gone over your, and I hate the fact that I was the one who did it, but it was a question, and I wanted to ask.
A great question. So
okay, it was a great question. And so thank you very much, Liz. We'll hand it back to you to wrap things up.
sure. Thank you guys. Thanks, Ed and Annie, for another brilliant demonstration of these incredible resources. Thank you for your vision, for all the work that you and your team have done to make these resources available. I can confidently say you've accomplished your goal of making history engaging, with all the visualization of data, connecting people to the past, and providing certainly teachers with new ways and insights to teaching American history. I'm also confident that everyone who joined us today will have found something that they can use bits and pieces in their classroom. And I certainly know that I'm going to set aside time to explore these resources further. So thank you guys. And thanks teachers again for lending some of your valuable time this summer. I know many of you attended multiple programs with Humanities Texas, and I always just want to let you know that your dedication to the teaching profession, to your students' learning is impressive and to be commended and respected. Teachers are so important now more than ever, and you're really an inspiration to all of us and why we do the work that we do. We hope that you have an amazing remainder of your summer. Thank you again for everything that you do, and we really look forward to seeing you at a future program.